Dom, what the hell is that?
I really wanted to open with these on, although I can't see with them on.
Well, because
Uh,
you're not looking directly at the sun.
I know, I
As
know.
illuminating as I am,
I was just wearing, yeah, putting on my eclipse glasses, trying to still relive that moment that I thought was so
we had
cool.
quite a moment. Yeah,
We did, but yeah, I can't see with them on. I know I can. I know you have to say them outside, but whatever. But it was a lot of fun.
it was a lot of fun. All right, well, let's start the show.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. So yeah, the eclipse followed the eclipse followed the earthquake
Yeah.
in the New York City area, which was but neither one of us got raptured away. So I'm not sure what that says about us as
I
individuals.
know I'm not getting raptured away. Um, but both of them, yeah, I definitely felt shook by that earthquake. I don't, did you feel it?
I don't know, but when you said it like that, I feel like that's a larger metaphor for
Yeah.
just our lives right now. I felt shook.
I,
That's
d-
pretty much like, Jenna, how you doing? Shook. Just
yeah.
period.
And then the joy of, I know not everyone was so impressed with the eclipse, what we were able to see here. I thought it was pretty awesome. Uh,
I did too. I sometimes wonder if our expectations sometimes can be unrealistically high for, I mean, like, yes, it was the moon passing, like casting a shadow over one part of America because the moon passed in front of the
mhm.
sun. Like, w nobody was supposed to get superpowers or whatever, like
No,
amazing thing. Like, I
speak for
sometimes I
yourself,
wonder, like,
Jenna.
have you seen too many Marvel movies? Because what were you thinking was gonna happen?
Yeah. Well, speaking to the person who has
I
R2D2
know, I
behind
didn't
it,
mean to.
and
All due respect.
then I know they're not Marvel, but still, yeah, I don't know. I thought it was pretty cool, just because, and you know what it is historically, it's pretty cool because when you think about it, it's going to be another 20, 21 years, and
Something like that.
until the next. I just think when you think in those terms, sometimes at least seeing it here, it's pretty cool. So maybe it's just that being a little pre-nostalgic.
Okay.
But yeah, that was awesome.
Well, anyway, so we've got some headlines, and I know you've got one that was actually pretty um timely.
Yeah. So now this
Headlines are
is
supposed to be timely now that I think about
they're
it.
always timely. So right now, this is from the Daily Northwestern, which is a student newspaper at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois.
Hmm.
The headline is Illinois Journalism Preservation Act calls for big tech to compensate local news outlets. It's by reporter Janya Sundar. Hope I pronounced the name correctly. And basically it just talks about, I'm just reading a couple of blurbs from here. So Illinois State Senator Steve Stadelman, Democrat from Rockford, uh, who is a former reporter turned legislator, introduced SB 3591, or the Journalism Preservation Act, in February. And it would require big tech companies to track and compensate news organizations for the content they share, display, or link on social media platforms. And this is a quote from the state senator, local
Hmm.
newsrooms should be compensated for their content. If big tech benefits from it on their platforms, there should be some type of reimbursement, a revenue stream for that content. Um, and it says the bill would create a structure and arbitration process for local newsrooms and publishers to negotiate with big tech companies and create revenue agreement sharing agreement for their content. Now it looks over here like they're going to be voting on the bill April 19th. Um, and it's modeled after laws adopted in Australia and Canada, which I think we've discussed before with
I think
maybe a
we've
couple of
touched
other.
on it. Yeah.
Um, what's interesting here is they sort of include a quote here from in March, Meta spokesperson Jamie Radish told The Verge, which is another online magazine, that news isn't the top reason people visit Facebook and Instagram. If the Journalism Preservation Act were to pass, Radish said Meta would, and this is a quote, end the availability of news again, end the availability of news in Illinois. Um,
How
and
do
then it
they
goes,
shut that off by state by state?
I don't know. I don't know. And actually, we were just talking about wanting to uh, look into this further and discuss this further. But that's a good question. I don't
Yeah.
know. But it says over here also, while Google initially threatened to do the same in Canada, the company eventually came to an agreement with the government to pay a lump sum of 100 million Canadian dollars annually to keep links to news articles in its search results, amounting to almost 21,000 Canadian dollars per journalist.
Hello.
Um, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting kind of we've seen this before, we've heard about this before. Interesting to see it starting to gain traction here in the States. People talking about it more, of course, since looking at the situation. Um, I would be very curious to see how, you know, places like Meta and Google would react to something like this passing. Um, because how would you how would you be able to, you know, how would you be able to sort of like end the availability of news? I mean, on social media sites, like how is that even possible?
Well, that's what one of the questions. I mean, like, is it just going to be Illinois-based news organizations that they're going to stop sharing? Or if you're living in Illinois and you share something from a national news network, does that go, like
Yeah.
I don't understand
Well,
how
let's say
you
something
execute that,
passes.
or somebody sends you something from a different state from an Illinois news network. Like, I don't know.
Let's say something passes through all the states. I mean, I don't know. Let's say there's a national bill. Like how I guess this is where it's so important to really figure out like what this would actually mean because I just don't see how you can get away with people uh go on the World Wide Web
Mhm.
to research. I mean, that's a huge part of it. News articles are a huge part of it. So I'm really curious how that would even happen. But yeah,
Well,
we'll,
they've said I guess other vaguely interpreted statements before, like they were going to suppress anything that was political, and then a lot of people are like, well, what exactly constitutes
mhm,
political speech? So that's we'll see what happens with that.
mhm,
But very, very interesting. Curious to see where that goes. I also want to bring up another headline that caught my attention. Now, this isn't it's from January, I will say. This was published January 25th, but with Neiman Lab reports. But what caught my attention is let's retire the leaving journalism fallacy. Your career as a journalist doesn't have to be a one-way trip. And of course, given our current circumstances, that was incredibly that grabbed my attention. But part of the issue, at least the way the author, and let me get the author's name in here, Catherine Reynolds Lewis points out, is the underlying notion of, quote, leaving journalism, unquote, as a momentous decision is the belief that journalists are rarefied ethical beings who aren't tainted by commercial motives. We are the fourth estate charged with upholding democracy. If someone steps away from this sacred duty, perhaps to make a living in marketing or communication strategy, they become tainted, or so the thinking goes. And then also, she goes on to sort of talk about, how being considered so precious can make a lot of journalists vulnerable. I believe the exact quote is that journalists can become vulnerable to exploitation and abuse by leaders of news organizations who leverage our passion for the mission of journalism as an excuse to underpay, overwork, and keep us chained to our desks or laptops or mobile phones. And I mean, I'm not a leader. I'm not in a leadership position, so I can't say absolutely yes or no to that. But I do think that's something that's very, very interesting. I mean, the prospect of stepping away or not being able to still do this simply because of the number of jobs, or perhaps if I can even afford to take another journalism job, is frightening. It's unnerving, it's confusing, and it's frightening. So I really sort of held on to that. And then of course the author goes on to list just, anecdotal examples from their own world of people who are able to step away and do something else and yet still could come back and continue on as journalists. Uh, again, I don't really know because we are in such a uniquely
Yeah.
challenging job market right now, but that piece
I,
really, really grabbed my attention.
I think anything that sort of brings the idea of trying to be prepared to pivot if need be is good. But
Yes.
I do agree with you in the fact that I don't know how easily it's going to be to jump back in the future. We don't know. Right now it doesn't look as good in terms of opportunity. We don't know where journalism is headed.
No.
We don't know where local journalism is headed over the next, maybe I think I understand some of the people who are mentioned in there, it might have been something maybe 10, 15 years ago, or even a few years ago, maybe it was easy to jump back in. I don't know how that's going to be 5, 10 years from now, especially if there isn't anything in place to sort of protect um, journalists, jobs, and um, or ways of thinking, how do we
Or if
change the industry?
organizations aren't staffing up the way that they used to, which again remains to be seen, but is
Yeah.
definitely a question mark. Well, anyway, on that note, I really was just like, you know what? I really want to talk to somebody who did pivot away and are they still living and breathing? And so, farming out from my journalist network, we found an individual who did just that and apparently is thriving. All right. So joining us this week, we have someone who is currently a partner with Ichor Strategies, but I would like to think that I know him. We know him. He's very famous to New York State journalists as the former Daily News Albany bureau chief, Ken Lovett. Ken, welcome to the show.
Good to be here. Thank you. I love that intro.
Well, I'm so happy that you joined us on the podcast because one of the big questions that I think is going to be facing a lot of journalists right now is to pivot or not to pivot. And so that is a step that you were able to take of your own free will. You weren't laid off or kicked out or anything else like that. But so very quickly, starting off, what is it that you're doing now?
So I work for a firm, Ichor Strategies. It's a consulting firm. We do no lobbying. Um, we work with Fortune 500 companies and public sector clients. I actually head up the public sector practice um, to try and help with equitable deployment of capital, particularly to areas that have long been ignored. Uh, So in that regard, it's helping areas that need it. It's sort of loosely connected to my former job.
Okay. Well, to sort of build on that, how did you get to there? Like, because again, I met you as Albany bureau chief for the Daily News. So how did you get from Daily News reporter to where you are now?
Um, well, this is actually the third. I've been out of journalism now a little over 5 years. It's actually the third job. So I was at the MTA for 2 years as a senior advisor to the CEO and chair, and before that, I was at another firm for about 8.5 months. Um, the career change, I did it for 30 years. I always thought I'd retire in it as a journalist. That's who I was. That's how I identified myself, like most journalists. A lot of hours. Uh, the I really reached the decision that ultimately I'm not going to retire there, and not because my own. Eventually, whether it was the Daily News or somewhere else, was going to say, oh, we like what Lovett does, but too much money, too old, bye. And so that's where I didn't like where the industry was heading in terms of that kind of stuff. I watched the Daily News lay off half its staff at the time before, about 6 months before I left. I just didn't, and they weren't alone. It wasn't a singular situation. So I just thought it was the right time, and rather than wait till I got laid off and wait till a bunch of people got laid off and we're all competing for the same jobs. I just had enough. When I started in the field, I wanted to work for a New York City paper. I got to work for two, the Daily News and the New York Post. I wanted to make a difference. I feel in my time I did. Um, so I didn't leave with any goals unattained. So I think it made it a little easier to transition.
Ken, there are so many journalists out there right now who have been laid off, not by their choice, of course, and they probably are wondering, what do I do? And Jen and I have discussed this too about trying to pivot and figure out where to go. Being somebody who did pivot, what would you tell people who are journalists or people in this situation who you would be like, these are skills you have that you
Mhm.
could pivot into these different industries or these different jobs. Like you have more value. Like what are the valuable skills that we do have as journalists that maybe some of us might not give
I mean,
ourselves credit for?
that's a really good question. Critical thinking, speed, um, the ability to write and communicate complicated matters. As journalists, especially for people who covered politics in the Capitol, you have to know budgets, you have to know all different issues, you have to be able to think quickly, you have to know when someone's not telling you the truth. I mean, those all translate. I think the biggest thing is to just if to try. You're not locked into anything. And I kind of feel that there's almost a liberation, because I had a discussion with some friends, my wife and I, and one of the people said, if you can move anywhere, where would you move? And this was not long after I left the Daily News. And my wife immediately said Virginia. And I kind of chuckled. I said, a couple of months ago, this would have been a totally different discussion because I would have thought in my head, all right, if we're going to move to Virginia, I got to find a comparable reporting job. I've got to, and now it's just about finding a job and doing something that you want to get up for. If one doesn't work for you, then look for something else. It's it's not the same. If I miss anything, I miss the feeling of purpose that I had as a reporter. I feel I have it at my new job to an extent, but I do miss that feeling of purpose, but I don't miss the day to day. And if you can find something that you enjoy doing and throw yourself into it, I think it makes the transition easier. But for me, again, it was easier because I did leave on my own. I know a lot of people who didn't and really missed it. It took them a good year or two to really get over that. And but I think just trying things, and if you find yourself in a situation you don't like, then try something else.
It's so funny that you say that, and especially highlighting the critical thinking skills, because those are all skills that we have brought to stories and reporting and everything else. But when it comes to ourselves, I'm stuck. So I want to get just from your experience, why is it that this can be such an all-consuming career or job choice? Like it's not, yeah, it's not just a job. It becomes who you are.
It does. There are people who work to live, and there's people who live to work. And I definitely, for 30 years, was someone who lived to work. If I'm on vacation, you'd probably catch me on a phone. I've literally done interviewed on boat rides or on the beach, and I think it's just a calling. And I always kind of jokingly refer to it as a first spouse, right? You put up with a lot more because you're in love. So less money for a lot of it, abuse from editors, things like that. But you put up with it because you really believe in what you're doing. You really love it. Yeah, I think you have to be a little crazy to be in the field, and probably a little crazier now to stay in that regard. It's just going in such a different direction. But people, I found the people who have been in it for a long time all have that same trait. It's who they are. It's a passion that burns it.
And I think because of that passion, especially when you're somebody who's passionate about this field, it's also, you kind of deal with certain things that maybe certain other jobs don't. And that's the fact of being, when we talk about ethics and we talk about how we report stories, trying to be, that does seem to add what, it adds a complication. What's something, Ken, that you notice that once you stopped being a journalist, it freed you up to do something that you never would have done before in terms of being able to express yourself politically, or do you know what I mean? Like, is there something that you freed you up and you're like, holy shit, I can't believe I could actually, now I could actually say this and not give a shit of what anybody, my
Yeah,
editor says.
it wasn't a holy shit moment, to be honest with you. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, and we had a protest against the decision in our town, and my wife and two daughters were going to go. And my wife said to me, "Are you going to go?" And I said, and this is a couple of years later. Do you? I said, don't feel comfortable. I'm still not ready. And she goes, "Yeah, but what message does that send to the girls?" So I said, "You know what? You're right." And I wrote actually a comment. I said, I wrote not bad about it, but it was the first time that I went to a rally with a sign rather than a pad, and it was weird. It felt weird. Um, the first job when I was at the MTA and I had to applaud a politician, you know, that was weird. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. So it wasn't like, yes, I'm allowed to do it. It was a real transition. I'm more
Mm,
comfortable now. I wrote a column back in November after the after Hamas, attacked Israel, and just on the protests, and it wasn't taking a position of who's right or wrong, but it was about anti-Semitism. How like a lot of people who claimed to be protesting Israel were attacking people at synagogues, and which had nothing to do with Israel. So I, so I wrote that. I never could have written that. And matter of fact, I opened that piece. It ran in the Daily News by saying that for 30 years I couldn't say it, and now I feel like I can't keep quiet on an issue this important. Um, so that it's not like holy shit I can do it. It's it was a transition to be able to do it, and I still take it seriously how I do it, because in my mind I still consider myself a reporter in a lot of ways. I haven't done it for 5 years, but I try to live up to the same ethics, and so even though I'm allowed to, I'm very careful on how I do things.
Well, I think that that's definitely something that at least I would resonate with a lot, because I've talked to students and stuff, and one of the things that as our times become more polarized, that just living in the body of a Black woman, there's just no way that I don't feel the weight of impartiality. So I have kind of a two-part question, but I'll start with the first part for you, and that is um, the importance, the critical nature of impartiality, because that was one of the things that I always loved about your reporting. Like, um, you literally, like, if you want to know what's going on in Albany without like and all of the drama that goes along with the Capitol, you were my go-to.
Well, I appreciate that. But that was something that was very important to me. I had someone who we would bring our dogs to the kennel, and she said to me last year, she goes, the thing I liked about your reporting, and she was very conservative, and she goes, the thing I like about your reporting is I never know where you stand. And I was like, you're not supposed to. So I took that to be really one of the highest compliments. I really, even like I never, like, if you went through my Twitter feed even up until a year ago, you wouldn't see anything political. You would see maybe my stories, or I never chimed in with a snarky comment because I figured I'd be fighting enough with the governor's office or with the assembly or the senate, with people, that I didn't want to leave a trail of snark where they can say, see, he's against us, he's biased. I worked really hard not to do that. Even on my social media pages, my personal ones like Facebook, I never commented on politics, and I took that very seriously. So I appreciate you saying that, because that is something that was very deliberate. To say reporters don't have opinions would be a lie. We all have opinions. We all have our thoughts and feelings. There's people we like. There's people we dislike, but you don't want it to bleed into the coverage, and you don't want it to bleed into. So I've talked to people I've been diametrically opposed to and had good conversations with them and respectful conversations with. And and there's people who I haven't liked, who I probably would agree with a lot politically, and I didn't like, but I was very careful. I used to get into it a lot with the governor. Cuomo was, and other governors as well. But when Cuomo was, and if we were in a particular moment where the relationship was really fraught, I would occasionally have one of my colleagues read my story to make sure that stuff didn't bleed in. I took that and still do to that extent, although I'm a little more open with my views now. But I took it very seriously.
Well, I will say just for my own experience, if I toot my own horn here, that was something else that I also really tried to bring to the
Yeah,
interviewing that I did. Yeah, is that I always consider everyone has a story to tell, and it is not my job to judge your story. It's just to listen and help you bring it out. Anywho, enough with my resume. Uh, my follow-up though is something that I think a lot of us have wondered, and that is the state of America's news literacy. Because of course reporting keeps telling us that more and more Americans are getting their news and their information from social media, and one of the things social media really runs on is emotional charged stuff, so clickbait basically.
yep.
um and that tends, of course, to lead more to maybe opinion writing, but I'm not entirely sure that everybody's differentiating between straight reporting, analysis, and opinion. And so, from your perspective, where do you see where we are with people even understanding the news that they're consuming?
That's a really detailed question, and no, because there's a lot to it to unpack, which is yeah, I think now things on social media are made to look like legitimate news sources. It's done that way, so people don't necessarily know that they're not reading a legitimate news source. I think one of the biggest things, and look, I was a big print guy, for all those years, and I predate the internet and cell phones, but I think the demise or the demising culture of the print newspapers has hurt because you are not. I think it's helped with the polarization of the country because people now tend to get their news from sources that agree with them. So, a lot of aggregator sites. So if I'm a liberal, I go to a liberal aggregator site. If I'm a conservative, I go to a conservative one. If I'm a conservative, I watch Fox News. If I'm a liberal, I watch MSNBC. And the fact that we know that about those, news organizations, it's not how it's supposed to be. What newspapers and news organizations brought in general, not just newspapers, was a balance of thought, and you got other opinions. And now people don't want to hear the other stuff. It's kind of like you watch CNN. Yes, there's a Democrat. Yes, there's a Republican on, but they're screaming at each other. They're screaming talking points. They're not convincing. I always say it's really funny. I was talking to a journalism class years ago, and I hadn't realized at the time until recent, but before I did that, that Woody Allen, of all people, had a talk show back in the 60s. And I don't know if it's still on YouTube, this particular one, but he interviewed William F. Buckley, this great conservative thinker, and Woody's more liberal. And it was such a great conversation. There was humor, there was respect, there was an exchange of ideas. In a way, and it's a Woody Allen talk show, and but it's what I wish you saw more on the news these days. But I do think it leads to polarization because when you're getting your news sources from only those that really reinforce your points of view, it's preaching to the choir, and it makes you dig in even more.
But do you think though that this model that I mean, it's a business model, and they're all businesses, and they start to see that this is where this is what they each figure out what their audience wants, and I feel like sometimes you don't even have that conversation. What like you're talking about talk. I mean, we used to. I mean, working in cable news, they were talking heads, and you knew exactly. You booked people not even based off what they said. They kind of came on knowing what they had to say because that's what
Yeah,
the audience wanted them
yeah.
to say. I mean, looking at that though, I mean, so is you yourself, like, I mean, we've seen how it's also played off in terms of polarization within politics from national to local. And we know, you had a situation where you have an example yourself that you came into, and sir, in terms of, right, there was you were taking a picture And if
Oh, yeah.
right, you were, can you tell us a little bit about how that happened and how that sort of illuminated for you this whole idea of how polarized it's gotten within politics, not just from from the national level, but to the local level?
Yeah, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was out of journalism a couple of years, took the kids for ice cream, and I ran into six state assembly members, three Republicans, three Democrats, who were getting ice cream together, which in itself was weird to me because usually you saw them at bars, but not out for ice cream. But we started talking and reminiscing, catching up. And at the end, I always ask, I said, hey, can I get a shot of you guys? He said, yeah. And I said, can I post it on social? And initially they went, yeah, of course. And then they stopped and said, actually, please don't. They were worried about the repercussions they would face from leadership, from constituents, that they were hanging out with the other side. And it really struck me because the thing that I never covered Washington, but you heard about it there too. But the thing that always struck me about Albany is you fought it out during the day and you went to the bar and drank at night. And the fact that they were still doing it, but were afraid to let it be known that they were doing it, that was quite a change in culture. Another change in culture, you mentioned TV news and newspapers, they're a business, and they've always been a business. And look, I mean, you know, we had yellow journalism way back, right? So it's not
Mhm.
a new concept, but publishers and and TV organizations, they always were willing. There was a pride of owning a newspaper, and they were willing to lose money with it. And you know, the network news always lost money, but it was seen as valuable, and so they let that lose money because it was an important thing. A lot of publishers were in it. They liked owning a newspaper. There was a respectability to it, and now you're seeing hedge funds, you're seeing, just giant conglomerations owning newspapers and other news organizations, or and online organizations. How many online organizations have kind of disappeared or been cut back because their funders decided it's not fun anymore? Just this last week in New York, media news. You had the Daily News laid off a bunch of top editors, my old paper, including the political editor. The Schenectady Gazette, a local paper in Schenectady, laid off their one and only Capitol reporter. And that's like the local business here in the capital region, right? The state capital, but they laid off their capital reporter. And then Gannett owns the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, and they're out on strike. And the first day they were out on strike, Gannett shut off the phones. They like just
Wow.
turn their phones off.
Wow.
So their cell phones. So it's an ugly time right now, and money is ruling. I watch these hedge funds in operation, and it reminds me of that scene in Goodfellas where they bought the restaurant and they took everything out of it they could, and then they burned it down. And that's
Hmm.
what I kind of feel like what's happening to a lot of news organizations. They're being, taken for parts, and then just they don't even care about the news. The people who are still there care about the news, but the people who own them don't.
Yeah, we've really tried to, because we worked on a local news show, and we've really tried to focus on especially the importance of local news. So thank you for bringing up all those points. I'm wondering now for the work that you're doing, especially making sure that, like you were saying, capital gets to places and organizations that have been overlooked. Um, how much does your background, I guess, in, like, again, not just Albany reporting, but the Daily News and the Post weren't the only two local papers that you worked for. How much of that ability to connect with people, especially at the local level, comes into what you're doing now?
I think I use my tools quite a bit. Again, it could be strategic thinking. It could be, gauging the political landscape. It could be writing. It could be, a whole host of things. I think the tools I learned, I used to joke with my wife that she was much more marketable, that the only thing I know how to do is be a reporter. But what I've learned since I left is that it translates. It translates. So, things that you bring, the connections that you bring, the Again, the critical thinking, the ability to communicate, it's in high demand. People want to take advantage of that in a good way.
Um, and the one thing that, that we always ask our guests is basically, how did they become how did they become a journalist? Can you tell us a little bit about, for you, how did that come about?
I've always liked writing. I always was interested in journalism. When I was a kid, I really wanted to be a sportscaster. I read Marv Albert's book, and I would sit and watch the Yankee game or the Ranger game, and I'd broadcast it into a tape recorder. I was at the school paper. The high school paper, I wrote for them. I did news. And my first job, but you know what? I laugh about it, but I actually learned one of the biggest lessons. I worked for the local library paper. It was called Library World, and basically rewriting press releases. And so my first issue came out. I had like 11 bylines. And I went by my neighbor, and she looked down and said, "Kenny, that was great, blah, blah, blah." And my head swelled. I'm like, 15 years old, 16 years old. And then I went to the next house. It was already in the garbage, unread. So that was a good quick lesson. But then, I in college, I worked at the paper. I moved up to editor in chief. I went to school at the University of Buffalo. We came out 3 days a week. It's just something I always had a passion for. I did cover sports for a summer for a radio station. I covered the Yankees and the Mets, and that convinced me I didn't want to cover sports because I would have lost my love of it. I would have lost my love of it. And I love politics. I just didn't see myself going home after covering a ball game and turning on C-SPAN, but I do come home and put on a Yankee game. Um, but yeah, I started in Watertown, which was really small. The industry has a way of weeding people out. And so, my first job, this was in '88. I was making 15.6, 300 a week before taxes. And I was working 80 hours a week, no overtime. I was doing 3 to 5 stories a day. But I loved it. I loved it. And then I moved on to different papers, and then I covered the state capitol. And I was there for nearly 25 years. And it was just something that I felt was something my parents used to say when I was in college, "What's your backup? What's your backup plan?" I said, "I don't have one. This is all I want to do." And I kind of felt that if I had a backup plan, then I wasn't giving my all to what I really wanted to accomplish and achieve.
Oh my, okay. Whether or not it's logical or not, I always felt like a backup plan was somehow cheating on journalism.
I'll tell you, I was so bad when I was going for
Hindsight is so stupid.
I was going for an internship, and I don't recommend this to people, but my parents knew someone at the paper I was applying to, and I told them not to call him because then I would never know if I got it on my own or not. And now I look back and go, "You're an idiot. You should take all the help you can get because then just prove yourself." But yeah, no, I mean, I just felt that this is all I wanted. And at college, I basically used college as a vocational school. I spent most of my time at the school paper, and I learned a lot.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we can't, or at least I don't want to let you go without retelling my favorite Ken Lovett story. Here's the deal. I will set this up. So by the time we first met when I was working for the Albany station, and then I matriculated into the New York station for PBS, and that's where I was. And one day we were coming up on the budget, and I was monitoring Twitter because the reporters are always like, "Oh, we're almost close to da 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 da." And I think I'd walked away from my computer for like, I don't know, 5 minutes. I came back and suddenly hashtag free Ken Lovett was trending all over my Twitter. And of course, I was like, what the hell is happening up there now? I go back, I find the story. I luxuriated in it all afternoon, but you lived it. So if you could tell us what went on at the Capitol that day.
I don't know what went on at the Capitol that day. It was a normal day, and I was walking through the Senate lobby, which is outside the Senate chamber. The Senate wasn't even in session. They weren't there. And it wasn't uncommon. I used to go into the Senate lobby when I wanted to do quiet interviews away from other reporters. I was on my phone. And a sergeant of arms who I'd never seen before told me to put away my phone, which I did hang up. And I said to him, "I don't get why. They're not in session, and I've done this all for 24 years." And he got in my face, and I am not someone who walks away so easily. I got in his, and we went at it. And then him or someone else, called the state police. And to their credit, he really didn't want to put me in cuffs, but they kept saying, "Just walk away, just walk away." And I said, "If he walks away, I'll walk away," because he wouldn't move. He was just glaring at me like, 2 steps away. So look, if he goes, I'll go. And they said, "We don't negotiate." I was filming the whole thing, and although I've never showed the video publicly, and then next thing you know, they said, "Put the phone away," and they cuffed me. And there was no one in the lobby. So I didn't think anyone saw this, not knowing that someone was walking by outside the Senate lobby and took a picture. So I was literally in the car, the police car. To their credit, they took me away that I didn't have to walk through the whole Capitol complex. So
Okay, I didn't know that part.
the cops were really, and so I was cuffed behind my back, and I'm in the car. My shoulder was killing me because I had fallen a few days before, and said to one of the police officers, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "I'm not a flight risk. Can you just take the cuffs off my shoulder? I fell, blah, blah, blah." He said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we really can't, but once we're there, we'll get there. We're almost there." And he goes, "How'd you hurt your shoulder?" I said, "Oh, I was covering Cynthia Nixon. She's running for governor." Next thing you know, he's like, "Oh, do you think she could win?" And we're talking politics. I'm sitting there cuffed, and we're talking the governor's race with the state police. So then they took me, and I wasn't taking any of it really seriously. And they took me to the police station. They didn't put me in a cell or anything. I was in in an office, and they had said my editor called, on my cell, because they had my cell. I said, "How do you know it's my editor?" And he said his name. I go, "That's him." I said, "So can I call him back?" And they said, "Yeah." So I called him, and he goes, "Are you okay?" I said, "How do you know?" He said, "It's all over the internet." And again, that guy took the picture and tweeted it and said it was an assembly staffer. And he said, "Ken Lovett's being arrested in the Senate lobby." And so next thing I know, I get a phone call from Melissa DeRosa, the governor's top aide. And she says, "Is there anything we can do for you?" I said, "No." I said, "I do not want any special treatment." I really didn't. And so she said, "Man, if I only knew every time we fought, we could have you arrested." And I laughed and I said, "Can I tweet that out?" She goes, "Yeah, go ahead." So I tweeted it out, and I tweeted it out with the hashtag Free Ken Lovett. Next thing you know, what you hear is ding, 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 ding. It just started trending. And I was laughing, and I looked at the trooper and I said, "Do you mind? Should I turn my phone off?" She said, "Nah, just turn the volume down." And so then the Senate came down, and Senate Republican was apologizing profusely to me. This should never have happened, blah, blah, blah. Says to the trooper, "We're not pressing charges." So I said, "Oh, well, they're not pressing charges. Can I go?" And the trooper goes, "Yeah, you're free to go, but you have a visitor." Visitor? And next thing you know, Andrew Cuomo walks in through the door, like, "I'm his pro bono lawyer," and he's always acted like he freed me from a North Korean prison, but he's way out. And what I didn't think would happen was right around budget time. Yeah, they were negotiating the budget. So as we're walking out of the substation, all my colleagues are standing there, cameras and pads and still cameras, and you could just see. I guess I could say this on the podcast. You could just see on my face. I didn't say it out loud, but I went, "Fuck this" in my head. Step to the right. And I stood for about a minute. I listened to the governor talking, and I went back to my desk while everyone was interviewing the governor. And some quick thinking lobbyist had left a cupcake with a file in it. And so, yeah, and that story, I was due to do Errol Lewis's show on New York One that night. So I went in there. I knew the first thing he was going to do. And I was writing a column, and the original lead of my column was, I was kind of poking fun. And I said, "The air never felt crisper, food never tasted sweeter." And I'm talking to Errol, and he said, "What happened? Blah, blah, blah." I said, "Errol," I said, "I'm not surprised someone was led away in cuffs from the state capitol today. I am surprised it was me." And in my head, I'm like, "That's the lead of the column." So I went back. But yeah, it was crazy. And the thing is, 25 years there, this is the story that gets brought up at least every other week. Matter of fact, someone just sent me the New York Times had written about it, and they just sent me the anniversary of that story. They sent it. I'm like, I can't escape this thing.
I will say, of all of the Albany circus stories, and God knows there's no shortage of them, that's my favorite. That's just my all-time favorite.
Well, people seem to like, and I wrote the column. I did it completely tongue in cheek, and the guy who I was dealing, the sergeant of arms, who at one point, he was a bit hefty gentleman, as am I, and he said to me at the time, or he made fun of my weight. And I was like, "You're making fun." So I referenced that in the column, but the column was pretty tongue in cheek and but straightforward. And I ran into him that night. It ran, and he says, "I saw your piece," and I said, "Oh, okay," and he goes, "It's what happened." And I said, "Why? Did you think I was just going to trash you?" He goes, "Yeah, yeah, I don't work that way." And that was that. That was the end of
So calling balls and strikes even when you're the center of the story.
it. Yeah, I wasn't used to it, but I got in it. Yeah, it was very strange. The strangest part was when a news station up here said that, on the next morning, though, coming up, a reporter speaks out on his arrest. I'm like, I didn't speak to these people, and they were quoting from the column, and
No,
air, the air was crisper, never crisper, and the food, but they didn't put it in tongue-in-cheek context, so I looked like a total idiot, complaining about 30 minutes behind, not even bars.
Well, for the extra 5 people who hear this, I hope that this once again, for the 9 millionth time, resets the record straight.
There you go. Yeah, like
All
I said, comes up quite a bit.
Well, Ken, I really can't thank you enough for joining us on this new podcast journey that Dominic and I are on. But again, I love that story. But it is also, I think, really helpful, not just for us, but I think for other, especially newly laid off journalists, to know that there is life after this career. And also to keep in mind that, should, I don't know, the mood strike you, there's a possibility of going back. I don't know, but that's been really, really helpful to hear. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
thanks,
Oh,
Ken.
this was fun. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so first of all, we got through that a lot faster than I thought we were going to. I thought we were going to eat up the whole 40 minutes. So I'm super happy that we got to talk to Ken Lovett. That was great.
That was great. He really
And
dropped some great information on that too for people who are looking to change careers and seeing that how possible it is. You know what I mean? How it's, and I know he did it again without having been laid off, but
yes,
I still it showed just how skills of journalists, how they are so able to be used in any field. It just depends on yourself.
it depends on yourself, and it I think depends on what you are even willing or able to see as possibilities. Like, again, because we talked about how just this career path, this job is not just a job, it's a calling. So it
Mm,
becomes your identity. And to be able to see beyond that, there can be blinders on, like, wait, what do you mean do something else, or like consider something else, or like, and also I should also say, because it's also incredibly competitive, like Ken alluded to that, but it's also very competitive. So when you put your entire heart, soul, and being into building a career, I don't know if it's ego or just something else, but to walk away and do something else is just like, do you have any idea what I sacrificed to get to this point? I'm not walking away. You
yeah,
walk away. Anyway, these
but
could
it's
be my
but that's
issues.
also But that's also, I would imagine that's for anybody who goes into a career that feels like it's their calling, whether it's somebody who from a young childhood they want to be an actor,
Yeah.
or somebody who decides that they want to be, because I would think acting's also a very competitive field that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't always pay a lot,
Yeah.
and it's when you become famous that you get paid a lot. Um, but there are people who do that work and make a steady living. And I think that's probably something when someone tells you, oh, by the way, no, we're not, it's disappearing. That makes it really difficult. And there's other parts of media too. People who, listen, I think from a young age, I knew I always wanted to be involved in the media industry. I always loved television. I loved film. Um, I definitely loved news too. But I think that so for somebody to come to you and tell you that the jobs are shrinking and how it's being done is changing, that can make you just start to really feel a certain way of like, oh, well, what what else can I do? We've discussed this whole thing of plan Bs, and I think that it's reasonable to think that why would you think of a plan B if it's something you love, you know?
Yeah.
But this is maybe the point of like for all of us to learn.
Yeah,
There.
well, yeah, I think of the many lessons being learned, and we are in the process of learning all kinds of
Enrichments.
enrichments. Yes, I love that word. Um, but that might be the hardest lesson for me to
Yeah.
not just learn, but to embrace. Because I'll be honest, there's still resistance. Like even if I'm learning, I'm like, okay, I can learn this. Um, like right now, there's other enrichment that I'm taking in, but I'm taking it in the name of still being able to somehow hold on. To pivot is like I on an intellectual level, I'm there. But can I embrace it? Is I'm not there yet. I'm still not there. It's only been a couple of months, but still.
I think that's why, though. I think it takes time. And I think when, again, looking at Ken, he had this ability of knowing that, again, it was a choice. And maybe he was able to come to some kind of at peace with the change he wanted to make. But I
Yeah.
think he also mentioned, too, how for people who you don't have that choice, it does take longer. It's like when somebody, breaks up with you and tells you,
Oh,
you
oh,
know what I
that's
mean?
exactly what it's
It's
like.
it's a breakup and
It's
and
totally not
it's
you,
not you.
but it is
Exactly.
you and you need to go.
So, you know, and I think that changes how we feel about it. It's an emotional it takes time to move past it. So I think that makes total sense. I think for everyone. And I think sometimes it's unreasonable to tell people like, you got to what's your plan B? What else you got to do? It's just like, well, this is what we've wanted to do for our entire lives. And now, okay, I mean, it'll be figured out, but give me some room here to like grieve and move on or figure out, what else to move on with and see that. Yeah,
And that other idea of just like, and if something doesn't work, then you get a different job. I mean, listen, we're also in like what? It's like one of the shittiest job markets ever. So even hearing that is kind of just like, I don't know if that, but to think about it that way, there's a
yeah,
lot of paradigm shifting going on for me. A lot
yeah,
of paradigm shifting going on. Um, so yeah, that was I again, all of these conversations have been so helpful and so healing and so like eye-opening. And I think eye-opening either I think the biggest eye-opening conversations that we've had thus far have been the ones that have shown me it's okay. Like there's so much that I've held in because I am a journalist and I am, respect, but there's just been so much that I'm learning that I've held in and yeah, no, it's okay.
because I think in some ways that becomes the identity. We've just kind of discussed this with some of
Yeah.
the other people too. And when what you do becomes part of your identity,
Mhm.
then and you lose that part, it's like, well, wait a minute. It feels very personal. It
Mhm.
feels very um and again, it's sort of like being broken up with where you're like, I didn't choose this.
Nope.
And now you're telling me I can't do this. And it hurts.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we have to kind of again realize like this whole idea of change is really it's something I think that everybody has to get, especially if you're looking at this field, right? And I think little by little we're going to see it happening in all fields
Mhm.
because if you're working for a corporation or if you're working for someone else, um, it's just a reality of how the world, with technology changing, with AI, with the way that money is changing, how people are being paid, um, it will have an impact on us and where we find ourselves, going. So it's kind of like, okay, maybe everybody needs to think a little bit now and maybe the next generation is also growing up too, seeing this whole thing of what are different things I can be doing. So it's not just all focused, putting all in on one thing.
Well, that's also, I mean, I've said that to my dad and I did clock that even when Ken said like, he was what did he say 25 years at
Mhm.
the Daily News, like that's part of the past. The whole
Yeah,
like, 30 years with the company, that's part of the past.
it really is. You can't. it's not sustainable anymore. And whether or not we want to,
Well, yes, not sustainable, and it's not. I can't remember what the word was. Anyway, you're right. Yes, it's not sustainable.
so, but yeah, that was Ken's a great example of what people can do. And again, it's not everybody's path is going to be different, but you can do it. You just have to sort of, I guess, give yourself that time and really reflect and think about, where do I want to go with this? And that's kind of what we're figuring out, and what I'm sure others are in that same place too, who are laid off, or maybe people who are worried they're going to be laid off and wondering, before that happens to me, maybe I want to start thinking about that. I think everybody should be thinking about it. It shouldn't just be when you're laid off. It should be beforehand too.
All right. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett, research by Lori Ruthenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.